and welcome to the second episode of Women's Public Leadership Network's podcast series, Tips from the Trail, where we explore the path to political office from the decision to run to Election Day. This program features women leaders who are working in or around politics or have run for office, sharing their best tips and tricks for success. Formerly a Facebook Live series, we're excited to launch this year on new platforms, including Spotify, YouTube, and Apple Podcasts. I'm your host, Larissa Martinez, founder and president of WPLN. We are a nonpartisan nonprofit organization working to educate, organize, and inspire center and right-leaning women to seek public office at all levels across the United States. And joining us today is Valerie Dowling, Vice Chair of Women's Public Leadership Network's Board of Directors. Valerie Dowling has worked in the political process from grassroots campaigns to the White House. In 2016, she joined the International Republican Institute as director of the Women's Democracy Network, where she continues to work to increase women's political participation, leadership, and representation in elected office globally. Welcome, Valerie.
Thanks, Larissa. I'm really excited to join Tips from the Trail.
So when it comes to the confidence gap, I feel like women, this is a topic that we typically have to have covered in some capacity every single time we do a training. I feel like it's something that a lot of women face no matter where they are in their careers, whether they are a stay-at-home mom, whether they're a working professional, whether they're both, and especially on the campaign trail, if it manifests in ways that I think is sometimes really hard to navigate. And so when we're talking about the confidence gap, what do you see as kind of some of the flags and the things that make it difficult for people?
Sure. Well, I'm going to zoom out just a little bit and kind of start at where research kind of defines the confidence gap for people who may not be as familiar as we are in having these conversations. But the confidence gap really refers to the research that shows that women tend to be less self-assured than men. That in order to succeed, confidence matters just as much as competence. And so I think that helps to set the stage for our conversation a little bit today. I think that you mentioned that this is something we're going to be talking about in the context of women in politics and women in elected office particularly. But it's really something that I think is universal to kind of women in leadership across sectors. I don't think that the confidence gap necessarily is the only barrier to why we don't see more women in politics. But I do feel like it's a really critical first step to kind of talking about how we support women in a way that helps them to really build their confidence in addition to their competence when it comes to running for office or moving into, decision-making roles and really being set up for success.
Yeah. I think one of the things that, at least I know I see and I always find to be fascinating is that it's not that men are more confident per se. It's that they just don't necessarily see that as a barrier. They think to themselves, I'll just figure it out when I get there, or I'll find a way to get through. I'll make it work. It doesn't necessarily act as a hindrance, where I think for women, we want to feel like we know exactly what we're getting into. We want to feel like we are 100% qualified, that we are ready to go from the beginning, that we almost don't allow ourselves to have that learning curve. So I'm curious, in the decision-making process specifically, when you're looking at a job, when you're looking at jumping into getting into office, where do you see the confidence gap coming into play? At what piece? And have you ever experienced it?
Absolutely. I feel like women are conditioned from a young age, whether we realize it or not, to really value perfection and preparation. And I don't want to assign this stereotype across the board to all women. We're all different. We're all nuanced in how we approach our own career and, thinking about making decisions like whether or not to enter into politics or run for office or apply for a job. But I do think that does shape a little bit how we think about our qualifications. And so I think that makes us have some differences than men when it comes to self-assessing. I think we tend to default to underestimating our qualifications and really hesitate, while men may look at a similar scenario and say, well, I meet some of these, but not all, but I'm still going to put myself forward. I would say that's something that, if I'm being honest, I've experienced in every single part of my professional journey, whether it was my first start in DC. I was a White House intern for the summer. was the first time I'd ever applied to any kind of national level internship program. And when I got here, I was like, wait a second, I'm not sure that I'm actually qualified to be here. And as I got into the internship experience a bit more, I realized that actually what qualified me was the fact that I'd held a job. I knew how to show up on time. I knew how to answer the phone. I knew how to take on responsibility and be consistent and steady. And so I had the competence, but I really had to think about how do I add the confidence of owning my space now that I'm here. And I think that that's something that everyone experiences to different degrees. I will say the second time I really point to kind of really understanding the confidence gap in a new way was when I made a transition from focusing on domestic politics to moving into international development. And at the age of 30, I was a director of this global initiative, Women's Democracy Network. And I absolutely remember sitting in the room with my very accomplished colleagues who were experts in different regions and areas of the world and thematic areas thinking, why am I sitting at this table and what am I going to do and how am I going to manage this job? But I think, again, it comes back to you already have the competence. It's really kind of working on building the confidence to apply all the skills, all the experience and expertise that you've accumulated throughout your life and applying it to the opportunity that you have in front of you.
Yeah. And I think to your point, when you're looking at jobs especially, or even going into public office, it's feeling as though you have to have a one-for-one match with the skill and what you think the job is going to require. Same with being on the campaign trail, being a candidate. You feel like you have to know everything about it. You have to have an understanding of every issue, of what your position is on every issue. That, once you get into office, that you have to know everything. Mm-hmm. When I think to your point, which is super important, is that we inherently already have a lot of skills and competencies, whether it be multitasking or decision making, staying organized. I mean, so many things that women have that come into play no matter what role you're in, no matter what position you're in. And it's just more or less applying some additional layers to that in order to feel like you can really jump in and move forward. So with that, because too, you have an international lens, where do you see the confidence gap kind of starting to shift or having an impact in the diversification of leadership that we're seeing?
That's a great question. I feel like the confidence gap is really universal. It's not just unique to our own experience as women in the United States. It's also something that I think women all over the world are kind of navigating. I think we're making a lot of progress, though. I think we're moving in the right direction. I think some of that is even talking about it and being honest about how we feel when we're in these positions and getting to hear that from women who've achieved leadership positions at high levels. I think we're seeing women lead at all sorts of levels across around the world. There's women prime ministers, there was women presidents. You just see women. It's becoming more normal, right, to see women in these spaces. And so I think there is just power in that alone, and seeing more women in these spaces and hearing them talk about how they're navigating their professional and personal lives and how they're thinking about building their ability to lead on issues that they may not necessarily have a background in or be an expert in, but they do bring something to that conversation. And so I think we're making a lot of progress. I actually think, we have a lot of room to grow here in the United States at seeing women hit those kind of higher levels of elected office. But I do think that it's becoming more normal. I think people are becoming more comfortable with being transparent about whether that's, playing into their role as being a working mom and moving into leadership positions and how they navigate those things, whether it's talking about how their experience as an economist or healthcare or whatever it might be, education, applies to the job that they've been elected to do, because it gives them important perspective that I think helps shape those policies and better reflect their constituencies. So I think we're moving in the right direction, and I'm really encouraged by that.
Yeah. When I hear you talk about kind of the different things that are happening both domestically and internationally, and all of this talk about how we get women feeling more confident, more engaged in the space, I definitely have heard from folks, it feels like a lot of work. It feels like a lot of work. It feels like we have to work on ourselves. There has to be more resources, like all these different pieces to get us there. And you mentioned it a little bit, you touched on a little bit this last response, but why do we need more women, do you think, at decision-making tables? Like, why is it worth the effort? Why is it worth the work? And the work even of WPLN and the resources we provide to get more women into office from your perspective?
I'm so glad you asked. This is one of my favorite things to talk about. And really, I spend so much time talking about if we're going to build robust and resilient democracies, whether it's our own here in the United States or anywhere else around the world, you have to have the equal participation of women. It's impossible to get policies and decision making right if you don't have women and men at the decision making tables, helping to make sure they're best addressing the needs of all citizens. And I think that's a part that I really love about how WPLN thinks about this space. It's not saying the world should be run by women completely, but it's saying that women need to be as actively engaged as men if we're going to get it right and build the strongest democracy that's delivering the best results for all of our citizens.
Yeah. And I think even to touch a little bit further, it's also about diversifying those lived experiences. So it's not just women versus men. It's also when it comes to your educational background, whether or not you have kids, your employment, all these different pieces that come into your background that allow you to have a different lens if you're from a rural area, if you're from an urban area. And so I think everything that we're trying to do is to find different ways to reach women in their communities in different spaces to bring them into the space. So to that end, what do you think women need to do, or what tools and resources do they need to try and access to start addressing their confidence gap?
Sure. So, I think the good news is there's a lot of tools and resources available to women. And I think what I love, again, I'm going to keep kind of talking about WPLN because I think you all do this so well. And I think those resources and tools are accessible, right? I think it's really important to kind of do some Google searches, find those organizations like Women's Public Leadership Network who are hosting trainings and thinking and with intention about how to make those more easily accessible to women of all walks of life and experience. And then I think it's great to just sign up and explore. If you're thinking about running for office, the best way to better understand what that job entails is to go to a town hall meeting. If it's a city council hearing, an event with your mayor, go, sit in and visit your state capitol and watch what happens in the state legislature, visit Congress, sit down and schedule a meeting with your elected official who represents you. I think it's great to just kind of take those small steps to start to explore and better understand what those pathways look like. I also think there's so many people who've walked through those moments where they've decided to run for office or they've decided not to. And I think people are really willing to share their experience. I've been so encouraged by the incredible network of women across WPLN who are willing to sit down with someone who's thinking about running for office and help them share some questions that they might wish someone had asked them when they were looking at those decision points, or helping to reassure them they weren't an expert on tax policy. They were, a doctor or nurse or a teacher, but they've been able to learn how to navigate being an active part of those discussions and conversations. So I think it just starts with those little steps to kind of start to explore, learn a little more about, what that looks like, and then talk to people who've done it to help you decide how to make those decisions and when the best time is.
Yeah. Well, thank you. Thank you for the plug. We appreciate it. It's always nice to talk about the work that we do, but I also want to touch on the work of Women's Democracy Network because you all also play a really big role in bringing opportunities to address confidence gap for women that are international, as well as find those mentors. And I want to go back to the mentorship piece a little bit, just because I think, one, it is sometimes hard and intimidating to find people to be mentors.
Sure.
And then once you do find someone that you ask to coffee or jump on a Zoom call with, what's the best way to frame kind of questions or to begin those conversations to get at how they can be helpful to you in your life?
Yeah, I think sometimes we think about mentorship a little more formally than you have to. I think there are programs that can kind of match you in more formal ways with someone that you're looking to follow in their path. But I think sometimes it just takes a minute to look around and see who's doing what you think you might be interested in doing. And then I think it's reaching out and just asking about their willingness to sit down and have a 15-minute coffee, whether it's in person or doing a Zoom call, whatever feels like it's the easiest lift. I think sometimes people will say no, and that's not necessarily because they don't want to be supportive, but they might just not feel like they have the bandwidth at that moment. So I think sometimes it might take a few asks to really find that person who is willing and has the ability to mentor, whether it's in a more long-term approach or just an initial conversation. But I do think it happens pretty organically. I think you find those connections with people. And I think it's okay to think about, what do you really want to know? I also think that helps to make mentorship more effective. If you're just going to sit down and be like, tell me everything you know, that's a really hard place for people to start to figure out how they can provide value specifically to what you're looking for, or what you want to know, or how they can help you evaluate your own path. I think it's good to come into those conversations with some questions. Also, kind of sharing a little bit about where your mind's at about what you might want to do. Is it that you're thinking about running for office? Are you interested in just getting more involved? Maybe you're going to volunteer in your local party structure. Maybe you want to coordinate advocacy efforts around something that you're really passionate about. But I think having a little more definition to what you're looking for and that relationship can really help to maximize mentorship opportunities and make people more willing to say yes.
Yeah, for sure. One of the things that I know we talk about a lot too is networking and the need to do it. But I think networking can be a form of addressing the confidence gap when it comes to building out people that support you, or at the very least know who you are, want to get engaged in some capacity. So what are some tips that you have for effectively networking and building out that base of support? And for those that may be thinking of running for office, we call that the house list when it comes to the group of individuals that you're trying to engage and bring in. So how do you build that? How do you build out your base of network, as well as diversify it, build up that house list?
Sure. I think networking is an art form that you get better at over time. I think some people think of networking in volume or quantity, right? You want to go out, you want to collect as many cards, you want to make as many connections on LinkedIn, whatever it might be. But that's actually not really helpful in getting to where you want to go and utilizing a network well. If you're not building authentic relationships or making some sort of connection. I feel like sometimes people put a lot of pressure on it, and it can be a lot more simple than you reference house lists, right? And that's one of the first things when you run for office, or you're thinking about running for office, that any good operative will tell you to sit down and build, right? And it's basically brain dumping all the people in your world that you already know, and starting to put pen to paper on that. And so oftentimes I think that can help you see visually where your network is. You might interact with parents of kids that go to school with your kids, right? And you may see that they are in a space that you didn't think you knew anyone in. Or you might find that someone you go to church with, or, someone that you volunteer with is an elected official, or, someone who's in an area of expertise that you're trying to build your network in. So I think there's a lot of value to kind of building that house list and thinking about, really putting that kind of road mapping a little bit where your network is. Then I think there's a lot of opportunities to go and kind of identify where there are gaps in your network. What are you kind of looking to do with your networking? If it's for a job, you want to be networking at events where there are people from the industry you want to go to, right? If you want to run for office, you want to be networking with people who are in the political party space, or grassroots volunteers, that type of thing. And so I think that helps shape where you put your time and effort in networking. I would also say this: I think it's really important in networking to be consistent. And I think thinking about that and how you go about it, right? So looking to do it in a way that feels consumable to your life, where you have bandwidth, and saying, I want to meet 5 great people who I think can really open doors rather than meeting 50 people that I don't know what to do with, that I met once and never hear from me again. If I meet you and you are running a training program on helping women get into office, then I want to make sure I can follow up with you and ask when the next event is so I can join, or think about, asking you to grab coffee or something with a little intention to networking, I think goes a long way. And I would also say, I think it's good to have your core people around you that are going to be your primary source of feedback and constructive criticism, that also I think are a key part of thinking about your network. Who's in that inner circle that's really going to be the loudest voices for you?
Yeah. And that's harder than one thinks sometimes.
Oh, for sure.
Especially when you start running for office, you get really clear on where people stand in your relationships and network, which is always both a plus and a minus, depending on how it goes. There'd
be a lot of hot takes with people responding to their personal experience with that.
But one thing that I wanted to quickly address that's not always the most fun, but, obviously on a campaign trail or just in life, you're going to hear negative comments. You're going to get criticisms. You're going to experience some not so great things. So just curious if you have any tips for kind of how best to work through those and not necessarily internalize them and have them impact whether or not you choose to do something.
Oh man, that's a great question. I will have to say, I think we're going to have to build resilience if you're going to be in leadership positions at any level or any industry or sector, because there are always going to be those people who are cheering you on, and there are always going to be those people who are cheering to watch you fail, right? And they really want to see that happen. And so I do think that you kind of have to decide how much you're going to let in. And I, throughout my career, I've had to think about, how do I internalize criticism? How do I think about feedback? Where am I receiving that from? And that kind of goes back to that core part of your network, your most trusted inner circle of people. I think those are the people that know you well. They're cheering for you. They want you to succeed. And so I think that in giving them the loudest voice, they're your source of constructive criticism, feedback. They're going to tell you when you're doing things well. I hope they're also going to be the type of friends or mentors or whoever that is in your life that's also going to tell you when you're not doing something well. And I think it's easier to receive that because you know that they're actually giving you that in the broader context of hoping to help you navigate those challenges. I also think that, if you don't respect someone, then if you hear something kind of snarky or petty, it's easier just to let it go, right? I think that there's going to be plenty of that in this world, no matter what you do. And so I really do think you have to get kind of intentional about thinking about what you let in and just not spend a lot of time, paying attention to what everyone's saying, because I think that's going to make it really hard to lead if you're trying to figure out how to navigate a space that makes everyone happy with you at all times. It's just not realistic. And I think you're set up for success when you're thinking very intentionally about who those people are that can give you good, bad, and ugly feedback, and also just kind of tune out a lot of the other voices.
For sure. And for those listening, Valerie happens to be a dear friend of mine. And so I'm very lucky that she is one of those people in my life. And so I hope that you get a chance to get someone like her in yours, because it is really important to have women that understand the space that you're in and can provide that support to you. And being here in DC, we definitely experience the confidence gap all the time.
But it's important to have great friends, right? Who've been walking this with you for a long time and are definitely key parts of that support system.
Yeah. And also understanding too that leadership is a journey. And so you are going to evolve, as is your network, as is your intentions and your goals. I think that's why in another episode that we will have coming up, we'll address what's your why? What is your purpose? What's your passion? Because if you get very clear on that, it becomes a little bit easier to do what you're talking about, which is to narrow down who is really with you on the journey, who do you need to have criticism and feedback from, and then who really is not going to be helpful to you in the journey moving forward. So thank you. I appreciate you being so candid and sharing some of those best tips. Before we let you go, I have a couple of questions.
Sure.
The first is, do you have any recommendations on other podcasts or blogs or other things that you read or, kind of have in your repertoire when it comes to how to feel inspired or those kind of like bits of advice that come in handy?
Yeah, I think perfectly timed that we were talking about this. A good friend of mine, Dr. Margie Werrell, actually just wrote a whole book about this, and she has a PhD, so I'm sure her insights are going to be much more in depth than mine, but called The Courage Gap, and it's 5 steps to braver action. And she's someone that I've really enjoyed listening to some of her keynotes on the topic, and thinking about how I can apply some of the lessons she's sharing in this very real challenge in my own personal life. I also am a little bit of a nerd who would admit that reading biographies, I think, is a great way to understand that leaders, there's no perfect leader, right? Everyone is complicated and complex. And I think it helps to kind of look at someone's life who may have, kind of almost like a superhero aura about them. And to see it in context, right, of history, of their personal and professional experience. And I think that just is a great way to remember that we all have something to contribute. We all have a why. And sometimes it just takes being willing to say yes or to step into the moment that we find ourselves. And so I think biographies are a great way to kind of get some inspiration.
Yeah. Well, and especially too, because it reminds you they're human, right? They also fail. They also run into criticisms. They run into all sorts of things. I think the difference is we just don't see enough women at those highest levels across the board to really feel as though it's a norm.
Sure. I think that's something that's really resonated with me recently is that there's never a perfect time. If you're waiting for every set of circumstances in your life to be ideal before you say yes to pursuing your dreams or an opportunity or thinking about running for office or getting involved in politics, you are going to run out the clock and never make that decision. And so I would just say, keep that in mind. No one ever can control and align the circumstances of life to be the right opportunity. So I think it's just about saying yes. And I think that we talk about this all the time. We just need more women. So it doesn't matter if you feel like you check all the boxes. Whatever your life experience has been is valuable in the political process. And so I would just encourage people to think about being brave. It is incredibly brave to step into a public arena, to offer to be a leader. And so I would just say, please say yes. We need you. And that involves every single person and their lived experience is valuable.
Yeah. And I think that includes not just running for office, because I think a lot of women get intimidated by the process, but that's if you're an advocate, to your point, if there's a ton of appointments out there, there's so many different ways to get involved that just that one step getting in will start to help with, I think, that confidence.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a great reminder. There's not one specific path. You can be the policy expert, you can be the political operative, you can be the candidate. Or you could just be the volunteer. And all of those roles are equally important.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much, Valerie, for joining us today. We so appreciate it. And for those listening, we hope that you'll stay tuned for our next episode. WPLN is a national nonprofit working to educate, organize, and inspire center and right-leaning women to seek public office at every level across the U.S. and to be effective leaders. To stay connected with us, you can visit our website and find us on social media on all platforms, linked in the description below. This year, we're excited for our 4th annual National Summit, June 5th through 7th in Orlando, Florida. If you're interested in more information or tickets or sponsoring, contact our team at hello@womenspublicleadership.net. Thank you for joining us this month for Tips from the Trail. Be sure to rate this show and turn on notifications to keep up with future episodes. Happy trails!